Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. The first thing I tell anyone who hears about all this is that I didn't move to the edge of the pond to make enemies. I bought my place 5 years ago for the shade and the quiet, and that mirror of water that held the evening sky like a second story of the world. The pond is on my parcel, not the homeowners association's. And I had the survey flags, the county parcel map printouts, and a deed description to prove it. It's not grand, just under an acre of water when full, with a clay liner that a previous owner compacted by driving a heavy roller over the basin they carved. There's a shallow end where frogs ring the dusk, and a deeper pocket by the old willow where a couple of sunfish somehow thrive every spring despite visiting raccoons. I mow a little path to a small dock I built from reclaimed planks. A staff gauge I hand-painted using a metal yardstick, and some epoxy has been stuck in the muck since the first summer so I can keep notes, because I'm the kind of person who records rain in a notebook and checks the level at breakfast. It's a harmless ritual. It's how I know exactly how weird that morning was. That morning, I was scrambling eggs when a truck I didn't recognize eased past my mailbox. The truck idled a while as if trying not to be seen, then rolled on and parked at the far edge of the common green. 2 men and a woman hopped out, opened a tailgate, and pulled down a mud-stained pump and 2 lengths of 3-inch hose. One of the men wore a safety vest he didn't fill out, like a costume borrowed to feel official. It was barely 7. I slipped into my boots, stepped onto my deck, and saw Karen walking across the mowed strip behind the cedars like she owned it. She was the HOA president that year, a short woman with a terrarium voice who kept her hair in a perfect shell. The pump roared to life with that tinny rattle only older gas engines have. The men fed the intake hose into my pond, and I thought the cold air had misled my breath because I actually said, "No, no, no," aloud, as if my mouth could push the water back while it gushed through the outflow line down the slope to the storm drain. The story has 1,000 small details that I remember because I was too shocked to choose which ones were important. The pump leaked a dribble of fuel that streaked the water in rainbows. A red cooler sat on the truck bed with the lid popped, and inside I saw the corner of a receipt with a cashier's name circled in blue pen. The line they'd flossed from my pond to the curb crossed the corner of my lawn, where I set stepping stones last year to make a little shortcut toward the mailbox cluster the neighborhood uses. I had always let people cut that corner without fuss, because it shaved a minute and saved them from walking the long loop on the path, but there was never any recorded easement. We were neighbors. I never imagined needing one. By the time I reached the bank, the suction pit by the intake foamed. Leaves and a startled frog twirled in a forced whirlpool. The pond level, a number I could read at a glance from my staff gauge, was already down a half-inch. I felt the same feeling I once felt when a moving company started to pull away with my boxes and my passport in them. The sensation that something I own is becoming lighter, and not in a good way. I yelled to cut the engine. The worker in the vest held up a hand that said, "Wait," as if I were trying to rush him. Karen waved at me from 10 feet away and delivered the first sentence she'd clearly rehearsed. Karen and her HOA drained the local pond that I owned. I would write later, word for word, because that is exactly what happened. In that same letter, I would include the second part because she said it to my face without blinking, saying they were afraid of flooding. She swore the board had gotten warnings from neighbors on the opposite side of the green that heavy rains were forecast, and that our liability for letting a hazard stand was keeping her up at night. It would have been noble if it weren't nonsense. She held a clipboard with a printout of a weather blog that predicted a stalled front. She was half right about the weather. We were in for rain that weekend, but she ignored the fact you could study the mud cracks along my bank like a map. If they had called me, they would have learned that I'd logged 7 straight weeks of low levels, even though the water level there was the lowest it had been in decades. Is exactly what I told the county clerk, with the exclamation point I rarely use. And I can prove it. The staff gauge read 2.1 feet below last May's average. My notebook had 6 dates underlined, and the man who walks his dachshunds past my place every morning had joked just 2 days before that if the trend continued, he'd be able to cross the basin in work boots without getting wet. "Please turn it off," I yelled to the man with the vest. He shrugged at Karen. She nodded to him like she was doing him a favor by letting him listen to me. He reached down and cut the throttle. Silence. then the soft glug of the intake losing its prime. The pond, which was calm a half-hour earlier, had strands of suspended leaves stretching toward the hose like pulled taffy. "You can't do that," I said, trying not to lose my temper. "The first new fact you can use to measure my tone. I fail at confrontation. My hands get cold. I over-explain. Even so, I had enough presence to keep repeating the word can't because this wasn't a disagreement. It was a boundary. "This is my pond," I said. "It's on my deed. The property line is 15 feet outside the bank. I've got the surveys. You need a permit to discharge that into the storm drain. The county requires erosion control when you move sediment. None of this is legal." Karen looked past me toward the willow where my dock leaned. "We sent a notice," she said, as if that settled it. She meant the email newsletter the HOA blasts once a month that I skim for trivia about repainting shutters. The last one warned about low branches over sidewalks, not about draining ponds. "We had an emergency vote," she added. "We have a duty to protect the community." One of the workers tugged the intake back out and laid it on the grass while I stared at her. "Please leave," I said, and to the crew, "Don't touch anything else. You've got no authorization." My voice steadied when I switched from pleading to directions. To their credit, the workers were just hired hands. You could see in their eyes they hated being in the middle. They slung the hose back like a dead snake into the truck. I took photos of their license plate and the pump's serial sticker because the habit of documenting had already kicked in like muscle memory. This was when Karen's jaw set, and I could see we were about to find out whether the place we live together is guided by rules or by whoever shows up earliest with a machine. "I'm not going to argue in your yard," she said. "I'll bring the rest of the board, and we'll put this on the agenda tonight." She meant the meeting she runs in the multi-purpose room near the mailboxes, where I've seen people fuss about pool hours and hedges. She turned to leave the way she came, cutting across the corner of my lawn past the stepping stones I laid. A sixth sense told me to keep my mouth shut until she'd crossed. When she reached the trimmed edge of the common green, I felt a bitter little relief. At least this part hadn't changed. Despite how we differed about water, we were still neighbors who walked the same land. The irony was sitting like a stone in my throat, but I wasn't ready to pick it up. After they left, I walked the bank like a doctor checking bruises. The waterline had a raw edge. The shallow end was now more mud than water. A turtle half buried in the silt blinked at me. I scooped it up and brought it to the deeper pocket with my hands full of river-cool grit. The staff gauge's numbers were honest in the morning sun. Copper skaters traced the new rim of the pool like surveyors. I called the county and left a message with the general line, then called the number for the State Water Resources Office listed on a faded pamphlet I'd picked up during a tree planting workshop. I didn't use agency names in the conversation. I simply said, "I have unauthorized pumping from a private pond." And the person on the other end asked me to email photos and the parcel ID. I did, attaching video clips and the RAIN notebook scan. In the meantime, I printed a map from the county's online parcel viewer and circled the boundary in red ink so I'd have it ready for the evening, because that was the shape of what we'd be arguing about, my line, their line, and the fact the pond sits entirely inside mine. At 2 in the afternoon, 2 board members came by without knocking. One was a guy named Troy who never lifted his sunglasses onto his head, even indoors. The other was Patty, who once organized a swap for used holiday lights. They stood by my porch like they were balancing on the lip of my world. "It's just water," Troy said at one point, the way people say it's just money when they don't have to count their hours. I kept my voice even. "It's not just water when you're moving it with a pump," I said. "And it's not just water when the pump is connected to a hose laid across my grass." I explained again that the level is the lowest it's been in decades, adding a new fact. There's a pipe under the far bank that acts like an emergency overflow, set 9 inches below the top. If the pond were ever about to flood higher than that, it would hit the pipe and siphon to the storm drain. It had never acted, not once, in 5 years. I told them I could show them the pipe. They declined to walk with me. "The board has to make decisions for everyone," Patty said, like a kindergarten teacher explaining why crayons are shared. I'd like to say I knew every step that would come next, but I didn't. I did know this. People often forget the past favors you did them when they need a different favor now. They forgot that I own the land they cut through for 20-plus minutes every day. That line was the dryly furious aside I wrote in the complaint. It wasn't an exaggeration either. The path they favor as a shortcut, across my stepping stones behind the cedars and down the slope, saves the HOA walkers roughly a quarter mile. I know it takes just around 20 minutes because I've watched the same handful of folks stream through in the peak of after-dinner hour, start to finish, like a clock. I gave that little corner as a kindness, telling parents with strollers to use it when their kids were asleep, telling joggers that I didn't mind, even telling the landscapers to push their rattling carts there one day when their trailer blocked the sidewalk. It had become a habit so deep that people didn't even look at their feet to see they were crossing onto someone else's soil. A kindness can look like a public right if it goes unmentioned long enough. There is no public right, not without a recorded easement. I'd had no reason to underline that before. Karen had given me one. The evening meeting was in the multi-purpose room that smells of mop water and old paper. I sat in a folding chair 3 rows back so I could watch faces. Karen opened with a speech about protecting our homes and communications we've received about heavy rainfall. She held up her phone as if the weather could be stored in a rectangle. When she asked for public comment, I stood and walked to the front with my rain notebook and 4 copies of the map I'd printed. I don't have a booming voice, so I put the facts in order like bricks. 1. The pond is entirely on my parcel. 2. Nobody asked my permission to pump. 3. The level is at a multi-year low, as documented by my gauge and notes. The emergency overflow has never run. The deeper pocket is the only place that stays wet when the drought bites. 4. Pumping without erosion control and discharge permission is a violation of county codes and state water rules. 5. The workers left a fuel sheen when they refilled from a 5-gallon jug. I have video. 6. The shortcut across my lawn is not an easement. 7. No one is allowed to access my land to carry out board work unless I grant it. And after today, I do not, with the exception of emergency responders. 8. Everyone who uses that path is now trespassing. 9. If you are worried about liability, you should worry about that. When I finished, the room wasn't so much quiet as holding its breath. A man I recognized from the far side of the green raised his hand and asked if this meant the morning walking group should go around the long way from now on. Yes, I said, and then, because you need to add the lines that make the picture sharper, I said, this morning I saw a lady pushing a jogger stroller up the corner slope. She smiled and I smiled. That was fine by me when I was letting it be fine. But it's not fine for anyone to run a pump on my bank. It's not fine to drag their hose across my grass. It's not fine to decide my pond is full of risk without asking me. So I'm drawing a boundary, and I'll enforce it the same way you'd enforce yours. You can take a community's temperature by the way people look in one another's eyes right after a new rule is said. Some folks bristle, some look down, some look impressed, some are relieved someone else is taking a stand they didn't want to announce. Karen tried to push a vote while it was still warm. All in favor of mitigating potential flood risk by reducing the water level to below the expected inflow this weekend, she started, but an older woman named June interrupted to ask, on his land. June had grandkids who fish for bluegills at my dock with little bobbers. You don't see yourself as part of someone's life until moments like this. Karen said the words common good, the way people say the words sales tax, a bland necessity nobody likes to talk about. In the end, the board tabled it for a week, which was not the same thing as apologizing or reversing course. It was a way of avoiding a vote that would divide the room. But you can't table what's already been done. When I got home, the staff gauge showed nearly an inch lower than it had at dawn. That inch wasn't catastrophic for a pond that shallow, but every inch matters. And if you have ever tended something like that, you know you measure your days by such small units. I opened my laptop and wrote what I should have never had to write. I emailed the HOA board a 1-page notice. Effective immediately, I revoke all permission to traverse my parcel, including the informal path across my lawn behind the cedars. I listed the 3 common entries: the shortcut, the slope behind the cedars, and the stamped concrete by the willow. I attached photos in a copy of the parcel map. I said that anyone entering my land for non-emergency purposes was trespassing. I said I would post signs and put up a temporary barrier the next day. I asked them to circulate the notice to all members and include it in the newsletter. I copied the county's general counsel office email I found on a public page and attached the photos again, along with the video of the pump and the fuel sheen. I sent a separate email to the State Water Resources Office with the same attachments, a timeline with names, and my phone number. I printed 6 no trespassing placards and mounted them on little cedar stakes that I pushed into the soil at the corners of the area people cut. I also ordered a simple fence from a home supply store, a removable black metal garden border with spikes you press in with your foot. It wouldn't stop someone determined to cross, but it says this space is watched, owned, and defended by someone who lives here. The next morning, I drove to the post office and sent certified letters with return receipts to the HOA's registered address and to Karen's unit, because some things deserve a green slip that someone has to sign for. By noon, the county called. A man whose job, you could tell by his calm, was to hear stories like mine all day, asked me to walk him through what I saw. He said there were rules about discharging to storm drains, about erosion control when you disturb soil, about hiring contractors who carry the right licenses, about oil sheen in surface water, and that whether or not the HOA had a concern about flooding, they couldn't touch water that was wholly on a parcel without permission from the owner, unless there was a court-ordered remedy. He promised to send an inspector within the week. An hour later, a person from the state office called and explained the threshold for permitting if you alter a pond, and how fines are assessed per day per violation if unauthorized pumping continues. They asked me to send stills of the pump's model and the point they discharged to. I did. I didn't use agency names here. I'm telling you actions. A real inspector's hand wrote in a real notebook at my real water's edge 2 days later. By then, the neighbor texting had warmed up. One message said, "What's the big deal? It's just a puddle." And another said, "We stand with you. This is outrageous." June texted a photo of her grandson's face, solemn, with the caption, "He wants the frogs to have water." The morning walking group rerouted begrudgingly. I watched them pass behind the mailboxes on the paved loop, some glancing toward my place like I'd put up razor wire. I'd done no such thing, only the neat little border, the signs, and the stakes. It's remarkable how much friction a small black fence creates when it replaces a path that had become a reflex. I didn't relish any of this. I liked the shortcut when it was an act of neighborliness, but I liked my pond more. And I liked the feeling of choosing what happens on my land best of all. 3 days after the pump, the inspector came. He wore work boots that had seen places worse than my bank. He measured the slope, photographed the sheen that still clung to the grass blades where the pump sat, tested the soil at the intake for sudden exposure, and wrote down the serial number I'd captured in my video. He asked if there had been any fish kills. I said I'd only seen one turtle I had to help and some leaf scum. The worst harm was the drop itself and the churn. He told me in a neutral tone that told me he'd had this conversation before, that unauthorized pumping from private waters is reportable and that fines can be assessed to the responsible party, the contractor and whoever hired them. He said if I wanted to pursue civil remedies, I should consider a demand letter for restoration costs and a no trespass affidavit filed with local police so they could enforce it if someone ignored the signs. He told me to keep my staff gauge and my logbook going. "It's good evidence," he said. He also told me that most of the time, once people realize there are paper trails and penalties, they calm down. Calm did not describe Karen when the county's notice of violation arrived at the HOA's registered address. To her credit, she didn't deny it, but she did try to turn it into a story of martyrdom. "We were just protecting people's basements," she said into her phone camera in a video that made its way through the neighborhood text thread and then to me via someone who knew I don't use those apps. "We're volunteers trying to keep costs down. Insurance premiums are already up, and another flood would be ruinous for the association." I could have kept quiet, but facts like to be paired correctly. The new facts attached to their fear of flooding were these. The only basements in our cluster sit uphill of the pond. The outflow storm drain is in good shape and had been recently inspected by the city. The board member most vocal about flooding had just had a new vinyl floor installed in his lower level and had confessed to a friend that he was anxious about it warping from any water, even condensation. They also had seen a dramatic video from a different neighborhood showing water in someone's garage and had imported that image to ours like it was the same topography. It wasn't. Fear is a fog that doesn't map the terrain. It just dampens everything equally. I won't pretend I never thought of revenge beyond signs and letters, but the punishment I wanted wasn't to shame anyone. I wanted the board to learn in their bones that boundaries are real, that being elected to run the pool schedule doesn't grant you a general warrant to command your neighbor's land. So I did the most adult, least exciting sequence of things a person can do. I hired a surveyor to refresh the pins at the corners where the common green meets my lot. He swung his metal detector until it sang, and then sank new stakes precisely where the old ones were supposed to be. I filed a no trespass affidavit with the local police department, listing the HOA's registered entity and naming Karen, not because I wanted to see anyone in cuffs, but because I wanted a report number I could cite if I needed an officer to explain calmly to a stubborn person that the corner behind the cedars isn't theirs. I wrote a demand letter stating the cost for remediation of the bank where the pump's intake carved a notch, and for the time I spent rescuing the turtle and cleaning the sheen with absorbent pads. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle that harm, however small, has a ledger. The HOA's insurer did the math. They'd prefer to pay a few $100s for absorbents and a few $100 more for soil than to fight with a property owner and a county inspector. The board's next meeting was subdued. I sat in the second row this time. Karen's arm swept across the agenda items like she was erasing chalk lines. Pool hours, lawn weeds, then the notice of violation and the demand letter. She tried to save face by insisting the board had acted based on advice they'd read online about preemptively lowering ponds before storms, and a couple of board members murmured agreement, but a large man named Rick in the back, he rides a motorcycle so quietly you hear only the gravel crunch, asked a simple question. Whose pond? The answer sat there like a weight. Mine. Who told you could touch it? He asked, and Karen's mouth opened and closed once while her eyes searched the room for an ally. The silence was a forward motion she couldn't stop. The board voted to accept responsibility for the violation, to adopt a policy of not touching anything on private land without a written permission form, and to reimburse me the cost for the survey refresh, the signs, and the temporary fence. It wasn't an apology, but it was something that made a mark where it mattered. The aftermath was quieter than the incident, which is how I wanted it. A restorative company the insurer sent came with rakes and a soft rake that looks like a comb for wet hair. They smoothed the notch where the intake had eaten. They planted native sedges along the bank that will knit the soil and drink runoff better than the mixed turf. They tossed a few barley straw bundles that, according to the old guy who supervised, keep algae honest when water warms. He spoke to me like an equal who has lifted the same things and watched ponds through the same seasons. He said he'd seen worse, and that this would heal in a month. He squeezed the soil in his fist and smelled it, a gesture that sounds like poetry, but is just science. You smell whether anaerobic rot is a problem. It wasn't. There were social consequences too, which I neither sought nor avoided. Karen's term as board president had 3 months left. She was not reelected. The board she had led had done other things well, organized a block party, fixed the pool heater, negotiated a better rate for the mowers. But people remember the thing that hits their idea of fairness the hardest. She stopped walking her dog past my fence, choosing the other side of the green. I don't celebrate that. I've been the person who chose a different aisle in the store to avoid someone I'd fought. It's a small sadness added to the ledger, the loss of comfortable hellos. As for the shortcut, enforcing the new rule was the practical matter that moved me each day. The first week, I stood on my deck at the hour I knew most people cut through. A book in my hands I pretended to read. People would approach, see the small black border, the signs, the stakes, and then look up at me. Most turned without a word. A few mouthed, sorry. Though they hadn't done anything wrong to me personally, they were simply used to the old way. One young guy, earbuds in, stepped over the border without looking. I raised my hand and said, "Please don't." He pulled the earbuds out and blinked like he'd just stepped into a courtroom. I pointed to the sign. He nodded. The next day, he took the loop. Within a week, the reflex had changed. That felt like the most delicate punishment and the most appropriate one. Not humiliation, not money, but time returned to me in the form of 20 minutes added to their day. And now they're all banned. I wrote at the tail of my letter to the board because it was blunt and accurate. You can call that petty if you like. You weren't the one who had watched a pump drink from your pond, while a neighbor argued that the right to avoid worry outweighed your right to the water that holds your sky. When the rains did come that weekend, they were steady, as predicted, but not catastrophic. The pond rose 4 inches and then leveled off when the ground drank its fill. The emergency overflow pipe hummed for the first time in my 5 years, not because of a flood pushing over the rim, but because the intake notch had been smoothed and the sedges slowed the flow enough to spread the rise evenly across the basin. I stood in my raincoat and listened to that thin hum like a thread through a needle. Numbers calm me, so I wrote down each hour's level and compared it to previous storms. It was unremarkable, which is to say, the story the board told about saving the neighborhood from certain flooding never intersected with the terrain we actually live on. Weeks later, the county inspector returned to close the file. He checked the bank, took 2 photos of the sedges, and scribbled on a clipboard that this had been resolved. He reminded me that if anyone tries to pump again, I should call immediately, and that because there had been a recorded violation, any repeat would come with fines that step up like stairs. He was careful not to disparage anyone on the board. That's not his job. But he did shake my hand and say, "Thanks for being precise." I knew what he meant. Documents matter. Maps matter. Timelines matter. I had asked the world to stop running on vibes and start running on lines again, and the world, grudgingly, had agreed. Stories like this don't end with a dramatic act of punishment. They end with routines that accumulate and change the shape of a place, which is more honest to how human settlements work. The sedges grew taller. The frogs came back. A boy with a new fishing rod asked me if he could try his luck off my dock if he stayed on the planks and kept his line out of the sedges. I said yes and watched him perch like a crane, earnest, careful. He told me he was saving to buy a lure kit and that he'd seen a snapping turtle near the willow last summer. He said his grandma, June, made him write thank you notes, and he wondered if he should write one for this. I told him that a wave was plenty. Later, an envelope with his handwriting appeared in my mailbox anyway, a folded piece of notebook paper that said, "Thanks for the pond," spelled correctly, underlined once. I taped it to the inside of a kitchen cabinet where I keep my measuring cups. As for Karen, we exchanged nods once in the grocery store a few miles away, both of us gripping cart handles, both pretending there wasn't a river of thought inside our heads. She said, "How's the pond?" And I said, "Good." And she said, "That's good." And we both looked at a pyramid of apples like it held a secret. I don't hate her. I don't think she is a villain in a story that requires ones. I think she did a thing people do when they mistake worry for authority. She added new facts later in a different tone, that a neighbor sent her a video of a flooded basement in a different county, and she panicked, that someone on the board's group chat told her if she didn't act and there was a flood, it would be her fault, that she had recently had a fight with her insurance agent about premiums. She apologized in a manner that tracked with who she is. She didn't say sorry, but she said, "I wouldn't do it the same way again. That'll do. Because I collect and pair facts like a hobby. Here are the ones I added to each of the original facts for the sake of truth's symmetry. Karen and her HOA drained the local pond that I owned, is now braided with the details that they hired a contractor with an old pump whose carburetor leaked, paid cash based on a crumpled receipt in a red cooler, showed up at dawn without permit or permission, and fed the discharge down a curb that leads to a storm drain not built to filter out sediment stirred by suction. Saying they were afraid of flooding is now tied to their misunderstanding of how the overflow pipe works. A social video from a different neighborhood, a board member's anxiety about a new vinyl floor, and the very real truth that insurance deductibles make cautious people do rash things. Even though the water level there was the lowest it had been in decades. Sits next to my staff gauge, reading 2.1 feet below my 5-year mean. The mud cracks that lasted until the late rains, the old-timer's walking story about crossing in boots, and the rain gauge on my porch that showed 7 straight weeks of meager totals. They forgot that I own the land they cut through for 20-plus minutes every day, is now joined by the map I printed, the survey pins refreshed by a professional, the stepping stones I laid out of kindness, the no trespass affidavit with a case number, and the security camera clip that shows the evening flow of neighbors who used to nick my corner silently like birds cutting a wind. And now they're all banned. is coupled with the signs I posted, the border I pressed into the soil, the certified letters with green slips someone had to sign, the board vote adopting a new policy about touching private property, the insurer's reimbursement for my costs, and the fence that is still there. A thin black line that is less a wall than a sentence you pause at before you take another path. If punishment implies learning, then there was punishment. The board paid fines to the county. They covered my costs. They lost a president at the next vote. They ceased using the shortcut and adjusted their daily habits. The contractor was flagged by the county and had to undergo a class on proper discharge and erosion control before renewing his license, which, according to the inspector, is a thing they make small operators sit through in a fluorescent-lit room where the coffee is just warm enough to keep you from sleeping. The HOA had to hold a workshop on property lines and permissions where a lawyer with a tidy beard explained, in simple language, that association areas stop at defined boundaries and that volunteer energy does not expand those boundaries by force of will. I didn't tell this story on the internet because I didn't want the performative mess that comes with strangers opining on a neighborhood's business. I told it to friends on my porch while the light fell into the pond, and we could see our faces double in the water. They asked if I would ever reopen the shortcut. I said maybe, someday, if a few things happen. If the board keeps its policy and respects the letter of permission in every case where boundaries are soft, if the new president stops seeing the pond as a hazard on a checklist and starts seeing it as a small ecologic that holds swallows, dragonflies, and an autumn moon's raveled ribbon, if someone writes an apology that feels like a bridge, not a loophole, then maybe I'll pull a section of the little border and let the 20 minutes flow again. Until then, I walk the loop myself now and then just to keep the numbers honest. It takes 22 minutes at my pace, 20 if I'm moving. I see the pond from the far side and it looks smaller, though still complete. The sedges shift with the breeze like a page being turned. In certain hours, the water is so still that the sky printed on it looks more substantial than the actual sky. That is the kind of fact that doesn't break into legal precedent, but it rules me anyway. It is why I kept records. It is why I installed a gauge. It is why I walked out with my boots and told a man in a vest to cut the engine. When people ask whether there is justice in such small affairs, I tell them this: justice is not a capital J thing that arrives with trumpets. It is a level established and maintained. It is a line on a map and a quiet adherence to it. It is a set of signs that don't shout, just inform. It is a boy with a borrowed rod standing on a dock he didn't build, keeping his feet out of the sedges because the person who built the dock asked him to. It is a walking group adjusting their route without complaint after the first week. It is an ex-president of a board lifting her hand in a grocery store, a small acknowledgement that we inhabit the same place and that she now knows which parts of it are hers to touch. There is an ending, too. Not dramatic, but firm. The pond refilled to its normal shoulder by late spring. The county's case closed with the notation, compliant. The sedges threw seed. I added 2 flat stones at the bank's edge that make it easier for turtles to climb if the water dips again. The staff gauge is still there, the numbers worn where the summer sun hits, and I still mark the level after storms. People still ask me for updates as if the pond were a person who might be in better spirits one week than another. I answer the same way. It's good. It's holding. I am telling this now to draw an accurate map of the terrain, so that when I say the sentences that started this all, they carry their proper weight, and nothing more. Karen and her HOA drained the local pond that I owned, saying they were afraid of flooding, even though the water level there was the lowest it had been in decades. They forgot that I own the land they cut through for 20-plus minutes every day. And now they're all banned. In between those sentences are surveys, calls, emails, notices, fines, fences, sedges, and a boy who wrote a thank you note. If that sounds like a lot, that's because boundaries, once forgotten, require many small things to be remembered again. There's no villain left in my version of the story, only a teachable curve and the memory of a pump's rattle in the morning air. Some days I wish none of it had happened, and the shortcut still carried its quiet traffic, and the pond had never had its hour of exhaust rainbow. Most days, I'm glad for the clarity that settles between people when a line is honored. I wanted nothing more than to wake, make eggs, check the gauge, and let the day pour by unremarked. It turns out maintaining such simplicity takes a stack of documents, an inspector with a clipboard, and a man at a county desk who knows how to close a file neatly. It takes me too, willing to be the person who says no, and then yes later when it feels right. I learned to like that role. Not the enforcer exactly, but the caretaker of an edge. Edges are where frogs sing, where sedges root, where children kneel to watch skaters sew their seams across an inch of wind. I have the right to keep that edge and to decide who crosses it. That's not drama. That's home. Thank you for watching.